So today we're going to go over the opioid crisis. This is kind of a bummer of a topic, so I decided to film it at the dog beach. Here we are, so try and pay attention as cute dogs walk by, and hopefully none of them come up and interrupt the lecture, but if they do, we'll give them a pat and send them on their way. Okay. So first thing we need to do is we need to talk about the difference between like moral responsibility and causal responsibility. So, you can physically cause something to happen, but you might not be morally responsible for that. You might not be fully aware of what's going on. You might not be fully competent. So you might not have the same moral blameworthiness. So when we're talking about moral responsibility, we're talking about moral blameworthiness, or if someone's doing something right, they're morally praiseworthy. Whereas causally responsible is going to be something different. So, here are our first dogs. So, moral responsibility is about blame and praise. Causal responsibility is about what physically is causing the thing to happen. So, in terms of like the opioid crisis, you can think about it like this. The patient or the person who overdoses is causing their death. But who's morally responsible? Who's to blame for their death? Are they to blame for their own death? That's what some people are going to say. Some people are going to say, no, it's this larger system. But then if it's the larger system, where in the system do we, should we point the moral blame? How much is that blame being shared amongst people? Who's blameworthy and who's not? So to talk about this, we're going to talk about it in terms of like three waves. They tend to talk about the crisis in three waves. And so we're going to kind of go through the waves and talk about, who's morally responsible at which point. Okay. So first wave is going to be the overprescription of opioids in the 90s. This is going to start with Purdue Pharma. They created this time-release OxyContin in the early 90s. This is an opioid, and opioids, like historically, like ever since I want to say all the way back in China and the Middle East, very ancient medicine, well known for its ability to treat pain, but it's also been very known as highly addictive. So Purdue Pharma is going to claim that and this is without any substantial evidence, that the time release coating that they've added to the OxyContin is going to significantly reduce the risk of addiction. They ended up getting this included in the packaging for OxyContin, and that's what salespeople went and sold to doctors with. We'll talk about that in a second, but to get that in the package insert, they had to bribe the FDA official to get it in there. Well, so they bribed him in a sense. They offered him a job. It's one of these revolving door kind of things. If you want to get into that. That's a whole other issue. That's political ethics. Okay, so they also, did some false advertising. They also bribed doctors to write prescriptions. They suppressed some information. We're finding out that this is, recently and through court documentations, that they did have a study that showed that the opposite. I want to say in 96, so a long ass time ago. So then they also paid off the politicians, and of course, because we're talking about super rich people in America, they're hiding billions in offshore accounts. So, that all sounds like a super interesting class all on its own, but that's more business ethics. That's more applied ethics to business situations. But this is bioethics. So we're going to try and focus on a slightly different topic. But there are a lot of great documentaries that cover the crime aspect of it, from the law to the law enforcement, to the pharmacy side, to the journalism side. All of this, it's very well out there. Definitely go check out some of that stuff. But again, so this first phase started with these claims from Purdue Pharma, specifically with this Oxycontin with the time-release Oxycontin. Okay, so then doctors and pharmacists and law enforcement, started noticing this crisis, and they started noticing, more of their addiction and all of that. So this led to tighter regulations on prescription drugs and other regulations with online pharmacies. And so this actually is what led to the second wave of the opioid crisis. So what happened was around 2008 or 2010 or so, they started noticing like this huge increased demand for heroin from the southern border. This was the second wave, and it was because of the Ryan-Haight Act and the prescription monitoring systems that people were not being able to abuse opioids in the same way they had been. So they turned to heroin, and I feel like a lot of people are going to think, I used to think heroin sounded really bad, but then I found out that heroin was invented by Bayer Aspirin or one of the major, or Merck or something. Heroin is pretty much, it was actually started as a cough suppressant, so it was. I don't know. It sounds like the worst drug out there, but then it's a pretty bad drug. But and you think of it as a street drug, but it started in the same way that opioids, always started, or just prescription medicine. Not always started, because obviously they had their histories, but in America. So they started cracking down on this, and partly that, but they also have a. Fentanyl became available, so this is innovation by the criminals, by the people creating these drugs. It was around in medical circles, but actually synthesizing it was cheaper and easier. So it's, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about this. A lot of celebrities are dying of fentanyl overdoses right now. It's incredibly potent. So the quantity, they usually show it next to a dime or a penny. And it's less than the size of the penny. It's like a fraction of that is a possibly lethal dose. And so this is coming to the U.S. from labs from China, but it's also even coming from other big pharma companies still. So there's one company called Incess. They literally took the same way that Purdue was doing their business, and they started aggressively advertising their fentanyl product, Subsist. And that was just nuts. So another documentary on that, super interesting stuff. But again, that's not what we're going to be covering. Instead, we're going to be looking at more of the supply chain stuff again, but then we're going to be looking at rehab. What are the possible treatment options for people with opioid addiction? All right. So the pharmaceutical companies started by lobbying the medical community to count pain as a fifth vital sign. So vital signs are usually things like body temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, the very traditional quantifiable measurable signs. And so the pharmaceutical industry started lobbying the Joint Commission, the medical accreditation agency, to push doctors to adopt pain as this new vital sign. So this is obviously a problematic idea. One, it's hard to measure pain, not only within the same patient over different amounts of time, but also then between patients. So, a 10 for one person might not be a 10 for someone else. So it's hard to determine how much medicine you should be giving each person. But then also painkillers, by their nature are desirable. They do exactly what they say, they get rid of pain. So patients are going to be more insistent about receiving them. So economists are going to call this problem supply-induced demand. So firms like Purdue Pharma and public advocacy groups like the American Pain Foundation and the American Pain Society, we're encouraging doctors to way overprescribe these painkillers. So you might think, okay, doctors are smart people. They go to school for a long time. How do they not know this? And it's a lot of doctors really push back on this. They were why are we having to do all this thing? And it seems like it was very much the lobbying money and creating these new regulations for doctors. But so how were they convinced? And it's so as I was saying at the top, the bribery part, the Purdue Pharma bribed an FDA official to get the claim on the package insert. So the claim was that delayed absorption of Oxycontin is believed to reduce abuse potential. So as we were saying, the time release coating on top of the Oxycontin is believed to reduce the likelihood that someone might develop an opioid addiction. And it's like, well, why are you saying that? Like they had no claims to back it up. They had to bribe the FDA regulator. There was this other claim that they had, and they showed this a lot in the videos that they showed to doctors. It was that less than 1% of patients become addicted to opioids. So when you look into this claim, you find out that it's from the New England Journal of Medicine, and it was a letter to the editor, so it wasn't even peer reviewed. And then on top of that, it was only about short-term use in hospitals. So it's already about someone, supervising them when they're using it. So very misleading claim there. And then on top of that, to help explain, the addictive behavior that doctors were seeing in patients, they explained that away by creating this new idea called pseudo-addiction. So it looks like drug addiction, but they're really just, seeking pain relief. And it's going to look like it's addiction, but yeah, it's not. And it's not addiction, according to them, because it's not causing any psychological side effects. Which, whatever. So, and this is the great part. They claim that the treatment for for pseudo addiction was more opioids, because it's like they're not addicted. They're just seeking pain relief. So if they're asking for more, it means they're in more pain. So you need to just up the opioid amount or quantity or whatever. But really, you're just seeing them build a tolerance. That's all it is. So that's what helped start the opioid crisis off. People go to the doctors. Or so they would go into the ER, the doctor would, or they would say they're in pain, they might say they have a migraine. The doctors may be reluctant to give them opioids, but, they were told if a patient is 10 out of 10 on the pain scale, a scale that they completely created and told doctors to use, which is completely subjective, and not a valid scale. And then on top of that, they were told to, anytime someone's a 10 out of 10 with, on the pain scale, to treat them with opioids. So, patients would ask for this, and then they would ask for it again, and it looked very much like drug-seeking behavior, because doctors aren't idiots. So then some doctors started to become concerned, and then it was crazy. They were allegedly, some doctors were threatened with fines from medical boards for not treating pain appropriately, for not treating them with opioids. It's like, oh, Jesus. Okay, so, that might have been how it started. People go into the doctor's office and they're, prescribed opioids for an ankle sprain or a little back pain or something chronic, which Tylenol or something like that absolutely could have taken care of. And instead they're given these way stronger medications that they don't really need. So, if you were given a 30-day supply of opioids, you had a 30% chance of being on them still 6 months later. That's pretty addictive behavior right there. And then it's even still possible. So if you were only given 10 to 12 pills, you were at risk of 6% chance of being on opioids 6 months later. So this was definitely me. I had my wisdom teeth taken out, and I got 6 to 10 pills. So I'm glad that didn't happen to me. But yeah, the studies are showing the more exposure you have to opioids, the more likely you are to develop an addiction. And we talked about these 3 waves, is heroin addiction really, cause or part of this opioid crisis? And it's like, yes, it very much so is. 80% of current heroin users in the United States started down this path with prescription opioids. And again, they were just being prescribed for things like, an ankle sprain. Okay, so this might be how it got started, but how were people still getting this medicine? Doctors were probably smart enough to not to overprescribe, and but still, how are people getting the medicine? Because once you build up the tolerance, there's stories of people taking 50 to 100 pills a day, and it's nuts. So around 2000, there were internet pharmacies, and people could get the drugs without ever being examined by a doctor. It was essentially, heroin trafficking, just hiding behind the internet. So in 2008, Congress passed the Ryan-Haight Act, which regulated online pharmacies and effectively shut them down. So this is what then turned to pill mills. So that was in 2008. So between 2008 to about, I want to say 2012 or so, they were still doing the pill mills. So the pill mills were these pain management clinics. And they opened up, there was a lot in Florida. There's one quote, Palm Beach County has more pill mills than McDonald's, which is crazy. So yeah, what is a pill mill? You might not have heard this before. So there's investigators go in. They have these on the documentaries. They're great. So you go down one hallway, you see the doctor. The doctor hands you a laminated menu and says like, "Hey, it's a cash only business. Point at the menu, tell me what you want. I'll write you your prescription for that." And then you go down to the end of the hall and you fill that prescription at a dispensary. So the same person is writing the prescription just for cash. They're not really doing an exam. It's a cursory exam, if any exam at all. And then you're going down and you're paying them at the end of the hall. So these have been called, doctors who have lost their moral compass. These are, dope dealers in white lab coats. So to be fair, there's a doctor, Dr. Jacqueline Craigett. So this was in the Netflix documentary, The Pharmacist. So she's one of these doctors who ran a pill mill, and she tries to give this defense. So you could think about this in terms of an argument. Chronic pain is subjective. You have to rely on the patient's explanation because often there's no physical signs that you can objectively diagnose. So like that was, part of the problem with having pain be one of the vital signs in the first place. So in other words, someone's pain or your patient's pain is what they say it is. So in trying to help the patient, you're trying to provide them with the best possible care. And Oxycontin was an effective way to reduce pain, and so that was why it was selected. Okay, so you have the pharmaceutical companies, you have doctors who are prescribing them in the ER, and then you also have to think about, pharmacies. What are they doing? What is their role in this? The pharmacist is just, distributing the drugs. They're filling the valid prescriptions. Do they have an obligation to, stop and talk to the patient? So that's, there's a really interesting documentary on Netflix that The Pharmacist, I think I mentioned it, where one pharmacist takes on this moral responsibility, and he sees that as his moral obligation. So yeah, this is some people definitely see it as their moral obligation, or that they would be morally blameworthy. Another party that might be morally responsible here in the supply chain is going to be the drug distributors. So these are companies that are going to distribute the drugs from the manufacturers to the pharmacies and to the hospitals. So they have systems in place to flag any kind of suspicious order. So something that might be considered a suspicious order would be like, a small town pharmacy going from about 5,000 pills a month to all of a sudden going to about 40,000 or 60,000 pills a month. Like that is clearly suspicious. This was happening all over the country, situations like this, but the distributors were not, reporting this to the authorities. The companies instead were just accepting the fines. They saw this as so much profit that, the fines wouldn't, offset this. And so, there was not enough incentive for them to report what was going on. They were just seeing the drugs are being distributed, and I guess they were pleading ignorance in a certain sense. Okay, so, things like this, it started the prescription monitoring system, and since that's taken effect, as I was saying, this is what's caused the second wave. And obviously, so the second wave is going to be, a lot, the heroin that people are getting is from, cartels. They seem to be morally responsible. Obviously, a morally corrupt institution like a Mexican drug cartel is not going to have a problem with me saying, hopefully not, that they are morally responsible for the second wave. And I'm not even sure how responsible they are, because people were addicted, but I guess they're, now complicit in the supply chain. So the third wave was then fentanyl, which, these Chinese labs are going to be morally responsible, again, in the same way. But it's Purdue Pharma, and it's this lie that started it all off that really is responsible. Okay, so then obviously the third wave is the fentanyl, so the Chinese labs, but then we also have another pharmaceutical, incest, which is literally doing the exact same thing that they were doing with Oxycontin. What Purdue Pharma was doing with Oxycontin, they're doing the same thing with their product Subsys. Okay, so again, we're talking about moral responsibility here. We're not talking about causal responsibility. So when an agent is moral responsible, like they're supposed to have certain powers and capacity. Usually this has to do with mental capacity or the power to make an action. Oh, there's our next pup. No worries about it. Okay, so we're talking about moral responsibility. So they have they're mentally competent and they have the power to actually do such an action. That person would be morally responsible. They're blameworthy for what happens. But then also it requires a certain amount of knowledge. If you're ignorant of what might happen or you've been misled in some way, you are kind of off the hook. You're not totally morally responsible for all those things. So they're also, you might not just always be able to plead ignorance. Sometimes if you're the boss, you need to be asking these questions like, what is happening? Are there these overdose deaths? Is this addictive? Should we be concerned about these things? So when thinking about that kind of moral responsibility and the supply chain that we've just walked through, I want you guys to think about before coming to class, who is morally responsible for the opioid crisis? How should the blame be spread around? Hey, puppers. Hey, how you doing? Where are your parents? So sorry, today's probably going to go a little bit long, but there was no reading for today, and puppies, so hopefully it's not an issue. Hey, dog. Okay, so this is kind of a sad part. So a lot of people probably don't know someone who is suffering from this, or maybe you do know someone and maybe you're not aware of it. It's kind of a little private problem and issue that people have, and when people are talking about it, they tend to essentially wish that they would either die or it would end. Being addicted is not something fun, but it's still, there aren't a lot of outward signs, so you're not necessarily going to notice. But one of the signs you might notice is, people just randomly falling asleep places and falling over, which is exactly what happens when they overdose. So we'll get to that. So to give you that perspective and to give you some perspective, there's a doctor, so I just wrote down some of his descriptions. I listened to his story. So he's Dr. Stephen Lloyd, and he runs rehab facilities out in Tennessee. So I heard his story through the Freakonomics podcast, but I've looked him up. He is all over the place, very strong advocate for rehab and rehab facilities and what treatment options there are. He is a pretty incredible story. Definitely check it out, from being a doctor to then developing a drug addict to then being now a rehab specialist. And so before we get to the rehab options, I kind of wanted to just talk about addiction for a minute. So what it feels like and how it starts. So for Stephen Lloyd, it started with just 2.5 milligrams of oxycodone that he had from an old dental visit. I'm sure a lot of people have this. I've, just a pill or two lying around. And so, maybe you've taken it before, maybe you're saving it for, when you really have some bad pain or something like that. But yeah, so that's how it started for him. Could have, started for anyone. I think he knew in college that he had addiction problems, but not everyone's aware of that stuff. But he was even aware of it, and it still got him. So, he said it took the edge off. It was obviously a pain reliever, but it cured his anxiety and his depression. I'm sure a lot of you are feeling that at school right now, with COVID, all of this, it sucks. And, having a pain reliever, it does. It has this soothing effect in the brain. It also made his relationships feel easier. Who doesn't want that? I don't want to fight with my mom every once in a while, or my sisters and I are in, this tense fight. So, how would he get the medicine? He did this thing called doctor shopping, which is, you go from one doctor to another, asking for a prescription. But also he would literally just steal it out of people's medicine cabinets. Anytime you go over to someone's house, he would go to the bathroom, just look through the medicine cabinet. If you had any opioids, he would take it. It was gone. So what would it feel like? He, couldn't go a day without, the medicine, or he would start feeling withdrawal symptoms. And as he would wake up, so he would go 8 hours without the medicine, as he would wake up, he would start feeling withdrawal symptoms. He would wake up and he said his pain was like he was 80 years old and he was in his mid-30s. And he wouldn't feel normal until he took the painkiller. So the desperation of addiction, he described it as, what would you do? Like it's a craving for something that you think you're going to die without. It was 10 times stronger than his cravings for food. Like, that is nuts. Like, food and nutrition, and like, even if you want junk food or something like that, like craving bad food is like one of the strongest feelings I have. Imagine, how irritable do you get after an hour or two of, being hungry on a road trip or something like that? Imagine it being all day. Imagine it being 2 days, being on the brink of starvation, actually thinking you're gonna die. And the cravings being stronger than that. Like that's what it's like for an addict every time they start going through these withdrawal symptoms. Like, that sounds pretty intense. If I've ever been addicted to anything, it might have been cigarettes, and it never felt like that. Like, that is intense. And obviously, so your tolerance builds over time. So he started on 2 milligrams of oxycodone, just, one little pill a day, and he was taking 10 milligram pills of Oxycontin, 100 of those a day. And that was only 2 years later. So it took him 2 years to develop this addiction. And again, smart guy. He went to medical school. He's not some dope. He knows about opioids. He even knew about his own addiction, addictive personality. Okay, so there's the biopsychosocial model of addiction. This is something I actually learned about in philosophy of love, because your body responds to love and loved ones in the same way that it responds to addicts, especially when you're going through a breakup. That's when we would talk about it in our philosophy of love class, because the withdrawal symptoms are similar to breakup symptoms. You want to call that person, you don't think you're going to be happy without that person ever again. Like, you feel like you're going to die without them. But that feeling goes away after a few days, after you have some time and space away from them. But yeah, so this is the biopsychosocial model of addiction. So it's, genetic. So if you're, okay, that's not a part of the philosophy of love part, but obviously we're all genetically predisposed to want to find love, things like that. But you might have a family history of addiction. So then psychological, what kind of household did you grow up in? They talk about an ACEs score, so your adverse childhood experiences. Were you sexually assaulted? Were you emotionally abused? Or have you had chronic, experiences later in life, or chronic traumatic experiences? I think chronic pain from traumatic experiences. I'm imagining like a car accident, something like that. Those are going to set you off in the psychological category for addiction. But then also the availability. So if you have the first two, you're predisposed to it. But then you're also, you have the right psychological, profile for it. And then you're in an environment where it is. That's the social aspect. So when I say it's like love in the philosophy of love, so the social aspect, we can have these, there's these triggers, and it's just way stronger. So an addict who, has completely been clean and sober, goes back to a place where they used to use, or even they see a friend they used to use with, they're gonna start, their body's gonna start preparing for it. So your body has to prepare to get heroin or to get on these drugs, to start having a reaction to it. So as you walk up to it, as you start talking to your friend, your body's starting to get ready for the drug, and then you take the drug, and it relaxes. And so when you see that same friend, or when you're in the same area, your body's also gonna have that same reaction. It's gonna start preparing to take the drug. And then when it doesn't get the drug, it's like, hey, man, where's that? I wanted that thing. So the same thing can happen with love. It's like, I wasn't thinking about anything. I wasn't thinking about this. And then I like am, cleaning up this, cabinet, and I see this box of love letters from this old partner, and I start getting emotional and weepy over it. The same kind of thing can happen. But it's obviously like that's much crazier, stronger drive and addiction. Okay, so a lot of people would talk about this as a disease. So as I was talking about it, you're thinking about the neurons firing in your brain, and it's just not firing in the right way. And so your brain is, not functioning in the right way. So they would call this a brain disease. I used to not think that addiction was a disease, and I'm still a little bit skeptical. It's definitely not the same thing as like a normal disease like cancer or something like that. But so Dr. Lloyd, it makes this argument that it's going to be an argument by analogy. So, type 2 diabetes is a disease, right? We know that it's a disease, but type 2 diabetes we know that it's caused by behavioral issues, right? And that's usually why people don't want to say addiction is a disease, because it's just a behavioral issue. And it's like, no, the behavioral issue causes certain problems in the brain. And it's like the same thing's happening over here with diabetes. The behavioral issue, the poor diet, the bad nutrition, and low exercise is, causing to the liver or the kidneys to stop functioning properly. So it's like, if we want to say that type 2 diabetes is a disease, then we also have to say the same thing about opioid addiction. And we treat type 2 diabetes with medicine, and so why shouldn't we also be treating opioid addiction with medicine? So he's going to make this argument for harm reduction. That's the kind of rehab facility that Dr. Stephen Lloyd uses. It's called harm reduction. So he's going to say, look, he's going to further this argument of analogy, like, okay, so if addiction is a disease and we should treat it like a disease, we should use medicine to treat it like a disease. So another way, if you're still reluctant to thinking about it as a disease, maybe, whether it's a disease or a learning disorder or like a social behavioral problem, like it's a rewiring of the brain, specifically like of the reward system in the frontal lobe. And when you become addicted, like all you're going to think about, like your primary focus is just going to be the acquisition of this substance, of whatever it is that you're addicted to. So the brain is not functioning correctly. Again, like the same way the kidneys wouldn't be functioning correctly with type 2 diabetes. Okay, so overdoses happen. As we talked about it, opioids cause a sleepiness feeling, they cause us relaxation, they cause your heart rate to slow down, and it also lowers your breathing. So like, if you fall asleep, your body might just stop breathing, your heart might stop pumping, and your lungs might stop, breathing. Man, and so like you just essentially fall asleep and don't wake up. That's how overdoses happen. So when you see it happening, it's just going to be a person, collapsing essentially out of nowhere, seemingly falling asleep. Their body's going to turn blue, and there's not much you can do. I don't think CPR is going to help them at that point. It seems like the one thing you can do if you have naloxone or Narcan, if you've heard of that, it's usually a spray that you spray up their nose, and that's supposed to get the medicine up there, and it's supposed to work within minutes. I've never used it, but I've heard stories it's supposed to be miraculous and amazing and saves people's lives. And that's the best thing we have right now to stop these overdoses, to immediately prevent the harm. But then someone who has naloxone, they still need to go to the ER. They're usually on a respirator for like a week or two. They're going to receive treatment from the ER. But eventually they're going to be discharged, and they might be given some Narcan. They're usually given some information about rehab or whatnot. But about 6% of those people end up dead within a year, and about 10% end up dead within 2 years. So it's like they don't overcome the addiction. They tend to die of the overdose eventually. The ER doctor who was talking about that statistic was saying that there's no other problem that the ER sees with that kind of death rate. So yeah, it's just like it's an issue. It's like the opioid crisis is an issue. So I talked a little bit about treatment options. There's methadone, and then there's a new one, subrenaprone, or Suboxone. So these are two medicines that they can use to treat it. So these are both opioids, so they're also going to be controlled. Methadone is something that I think was used in the 80s or maybe the 70s to try and help. So it's very heavily federally regulated. You need to go to these treatment programs. You have to go every single day to get treatment. And so this causes a barrier for addicts, the restrictions on actually doing it. The other one, Suboxone is just what I'm going to call it, can be prescribed from a regular doctor's office, but they're also going to have to get this extra, training and accreditations. And the Suboxone is supposed to be better, I guess. It's supposed to, only antagonize part of the opioid receptors, and so it's supposed to have this ceiling effect. I'm not quite sure. I'm not a doctor. Definitely, check out if you're interested in that. Definitely go talk to a doctor. Okay. So the other thing is the rehab. So this is, I'm thinking about the rehab as our moral responsibility to these people who have essentially become addicted through, I wouldn't really say their own fault. It's through overprescribing. It's, through the pushing and the lies of the pharmaceutical industry. So, these people, how do we treat them? How do we respond to them? So about 70% of residential treatments across the country are going to be abstinence-only approaches. As we were talking about earlier, the opposite of an abstinence-only approach is going to be this medicated-assisted approach. So the medicated-assisted approach is, going to use methadone and buprenorphine, and naloxone to try and help treat these patients who are, suffering from opioid crisis. So they're using opioids to treat opioids, but they're trying to use it in a responsible treatment way. And I think that they were saying the people who actually started receiving this treatment were 80% likely to still be in treatment after 3 months, as opposed to, I want to say 30% of people who didn't receive this treatment were still in abstinence-only programs after. Anyway, the numbers are a little bit murky on which one's actually more effective, but just generally I think we need to lower the stigma on rehab. Okay. So part of the stigmas with the medicated assisted treatment are, this idea that you're trading one drug for another. And it's you might be doing that, but it's the way addiction works, the way this addiction in particular works, is that you have to slowly wean someone off of it. You can't just straight up take them off of it. That's not going to help them. You have to, take care of them and, treat them, and the medicines is going to be the most sane, kind way to get them off of this medicine that they've become addicted to. Okay, so another thing is that the pharmaceutical companies are the ones who got us into this mess. Why should we rely on them to get us out of it? It's true, Purdue Pharma, I think at one point was looking into, buprenorphine or methadone. I don't think they actually went through with it, but it's why should we trust them? And it's okay, I agree, not all, a lot of pharmaceutical companies are bad. A lot of pharmaceutical companies are not trustworthy, but it's some are, and some doctors who are using this stuff responsibly are going to be able to help patients. So it's this is the most effective way we have at treating patients. It's trying to send the firefighters in there to fight the fire without water. It's you need the water, even if the water is owned by the person who started the fire, and they're going to make money off of it. It's you still need the fire, or you still need the water to put out the fire. Okay, so risk reduction is this approach as opposed to abstinence approach to rehab. The idea is known as harm reduction or risk reduction. So the idea is that risk is not the kind of thing that can be completely brought down to zero. This also makes sense. There's going to be some risk somewhere, at some point along the way, right? So it's is it even a good idea to have zero risk as our a goal? Because it's that's not really an achievable goal. Another instance of this, so to think about the difference between harm reduction versus abstinence, is vaping versus smoke-free. So vaping is a harm reduction approach to smoking cessation. It's one of those things that's supposed to help people wean off of smoking cigarettes. And Vaping, allegedly, if one vape to one cigarette, I don't really know how to measure those, but the vaping is supposed to be less harmful on your lungs. And okay, maybe you don't believe me, but think about it like this. So it's like, imagine taking, when you're smoking a cigarette, you're not just smoking the nicotine, you're smoking everything else that's on the tobacco leaf. Now imagine if we could just take the nicotine, just synthesize that, and just smoke that. It's like, okay, then we're doing the same amount of harm in the nicotine sense, but the other products that were in the cigarette that now aren't in the vape, then it's like, okay, well, what is in the vape that wasn't in the cigarette? So you need to think about it in terms of that. If vaping is actually less harmful, then this is an approach to harm reduction. Again, as opposed to just telling people, quit cold turkey from smoking cigarettes. That's something that's, much harder for people to do, and it has a less effective rate at helping people quit smoking. Now, the field in opioids is going to be, or in opioids, the gap between the abstinence-only people and the harm reduction people is even wider. As I was saying, 70% of people in the opioid, rehab facilities across the country are abstinence-only. So it's so many more, and abstinence-only is it doesn't have the most retention rates, or again, those statistics are sketchy. So maybe I shouldn't go there. But yeah, so the idea is, just whatever it is, we should lower the stigmas with going to rehab. The people who are taking these pills aren't necessarily going to be responsible. They shouldn't necessarily feel responsible for their addiction. We should help these people, absolutely. So this also, leads to the possible idea of, what about safe injection sites or needle exchanges? Like, if this idea of harm reduction is really the way to approach this opioid crisis, like, does that also justify things like needle exchanges and safe injection sites? Again, a safe injection site would be where someone could there's a medical professional on site, and they would monitor what's happening. They might even be able to test the drugs, make sure they're not taking fentanyl when they think they're taking Oxycontin or whatnot. So yeah, can we justify these? Are there other forms of harm reduction that maybe we should be approaching? So these are other questions I want you guys to think about before you come to class.